Hello friends, welcome back, and today I'm talking about HDR. HDR photography, high dynamic range photography. 10 or 12 years ago, that was really all I did. I took brackets every time I went out to shoot, and I took literally every photo and merged those brackets into an HDR merged file and made edits to it. All I did was HDR photography, and the reason why was that camera sensors, cameras in general, were not as good as they are today. Software was not as good as it is today. But if you fast forward all these years later in 2023, you might wonder, are there situations where HDR is still useful? I mean, cameras are way better, software is way better, like I said, and it makes you kind of wonder if you really need it now. And of course, I think the answer is yes, but you don't need it all the time. However, there are situations where it comes in really, really handy. That's what I want to talk about in today's video. I've got 3 exposures here that I shot as a bracket set in Iceland, and this is a classic, really traditional HDR kind of scene. You've got a really big difference between the bright parts of the photo and the dark parts of the photo. In other words, there's some really dark stuff and some really bright stuff, and getting it all in a single exposure is really hard to do. So that's where HDR comes in. And what I want to show you is that you might take the approach that says, hey, why don't you just use one of the exposures and adjust the highlights, pull them down? Why don't you just take the shadows and pull them up and balance out the light in that photo without making a tone mapped HDR? Well, let me show you why that doesn't work. So I've got this photo here, which is the dark one in the exposure set. And what I want to do is go into raw develop, and the sky, frankly, looks great. I think the sky looks great, but all the shadow areas are just so dark. So if I lift the exposure, I'm starting, of course, I'm lifting the exposure across the entire photo. So all that's going to happen is the sky gets blown out. That doesn't really work. If I lift the shadows, I can go all the way to 100, but you'll notice when I lift the shadows, I'm getting all this noise and kind of mess on this right-hand side and these other sides, which is basically means I'm lifting the shadows too far, right? And if I take the blacks, because it's still not bright enough, if I lift the blacks, you can see I just get a noisy kind of mess. So that doesn't work with the dark exposure. I want to show you now on the bright exposure, because you might think, well, then just take the bright one and pull the highlights down, right? So I can pull up the shadows here, and that looks pretty good. That looks way better than the shadows looked on the dark one, but the sky is just a mess. And so if you pull the highlights down, even at a negative 100, it doesn't pull it back. And if I pull back the whites as well, that'll impact the sky some, but even at negative 100, I just don't have it. It's not there. So then the next thing that you might think is, well, then just take the middle exposure gem and let's go take a look at that one. So I'll go into the edit tab, and I'm going to go, let's see, the highlights. I pull this down. Those look actually okay. I want to pull up these shadows, and that looks okay, but I'm starting to get a little bit of that noise over here. And so if you come and play with the blacks and lift that, you're going to get more and more of that. As you add contrast, it doesn't really work because everything is not going to work together. I basically don't have all the information that I need in a single file. That's where HDR comes. So what I want to do is blend this together as an HDR and show you how it looks. So that involves me dragging these exposures over here to the HDR window. I'm fine with all the different settings. I'm gonna go ahead and click merge, and then we'll edit that image together. Okay, I've merged the frames together. I've got my base HDR photo. I also cropped it and did some erasing. And then while I was at it, I went ahead and made edits here in Develop. And what I want to do is point out specifically what I did, which is, if you look here, I pulled down the highlights, negative 100, and I lifted the shadows, positive 100. So my base HDR looked like that, still a little bit dark, but look at the recovery here and my ability to bring that back with a merged file. Even with lifting shadows 100 and pulling blacks up 54 and whites down, I was able to really just make a huge difference in that base photo. There it is before, and there it is now. So that HDR process is giving me a really solid base image to work with. And then these additional edits, even pushing them pretty far, I'm not getting all the noise and all the stuff that I had around the edges with the original raw file. And so the blended HDR file and my edits here are giving me a huge advantage in terms of getting this file to look the way I want it to look. Okay, now I've used super contrast to further refine the light. So that's what it was like before I used super contrast, and that's what it looks like now. Better control over the light, and again, still got everything looking great around those edges where you were seeing noise and kind of weird artifacts on the base images. So again, this base HDR image is looking fantastic, and this is probably a good time for me to pause and let you know about an HDR bundle that I've been building that's going to be coming out really soon. I announced it in my newsletter last week. If you haven't joined my newsletter and would like to learn about this bundle when it comes out, click the link down below. But it's going to have some of my raw files with private tutorial videos. It's going to have a preset pack. It's going to have a lengthy ebook all about HDR photography. And it's got several other things as part of that bundle. So that's coming soon. Join my newsletter down below. And now what I want to do is jump into the rest of my edits. And so next I'm going to get Structure AI, because one of the things I want to do is give this a little bit of kick. Now this is a little bit of an edgy, perhaps is the term, HDR, but this Structure AI, I'm going ahead and applying that everywhere, even though you might want to erase that from the sky, but there it is before and there it is now. It also gives a slight bit of brightening to the image. Speaking of brightening, I'm also going to use Accent AI, and I'm using this at about a 35, and you can see that has a huge impact on the photo. There it is before and there it is now. Next thing I want to do is go into color, and I want to go into the luminance of the blue, and I slightly want to lift that because, again, I'm trying to brighten this up a little bit and make it a pretty punchy, kind of impactful image. And there's so much blue in that file that lifting the luminance of that specific color channel is giving me, again, better visibility. And notice around the edges, I don't have any of the issues that I had with the base file. So that's telling me that this raw file, or excuse me, this blended HDR is working really well for me. I'm gonna give a little bit of vibrance there to the color, and then I'm gonna go up to toning. And what I wanna do is go to about a 40 or so in the highlights. And all I'm doing is just giving a little bit of warmth to the highlights and bringing back some of that sunset that was out there behind that gentleman that was posing for us. I'm also going to slightly tilt it in the amount towards the highlights, give it a little bit more punch. And the last thing here is just going to be a vignette. There it is before the vignette, and there is now just a little bit of accent there. And that is my edit. And what I started with was that as a base HDR image, but various edits allow me to control the light without getting all the artifacts and the noise and that sort of thing around the edges and those really dark areas where it had to lift the exposure in order to get some visibility into that part of the scene. So HDR has really saved this image for me, allowed me to create something that I'm frankly proud of and I like quite a bit. So I find that HDR is super useful in certain situations. Of course, you don't have to use it on every image these days like we did in the old days. Again, cameras are better, software is better, all that. But there are definitely times, this is a good example of when HDR comes in incredibly handy and can help you save an image or save a scene and allow you to make something that really captures the essence of that shot. That's it for this one, my friends. Sign up for my newsletter down below if you want to hear about my bundle when it comes out, and I'll be back in touch soon. I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon, and until then, adios.